This hangout on air is live. We are live. Ted Neward. Hi.
How you doing?
I'm all right. How are you?
It's a post-Thanksgiving weekend, so, still recovering, but, doing well, doing well.
I gained a little bit of weight. It's hard being a human being and trying to have balance and maintain everything. I need to close my window. But that's cool. Are you settled back in, or is this like is Monday or today just as serious as or are you taking a break?
Um, it's probably about as serious as it ever gets. It's one of those things where I try not to take anything too seriously, including myself. And so, yeah, I mean, it's back to the grindstones, right? Trying to get stuff arranged and coordinated and all of that stuff. But yeah, it's not exactly, it's still not part of vacation. You know what I mean?
Okay.
I'm in the office. Let's put it that way.
Now, like I know of you, but I haven't really done a lot of research. I've heard you on I don't know how to say his name, Sean Wildermuth.
Wildermuth.
Sean
Wildermuth.
Wildermuth. I
Yeah.
heard you on his show, but I even knew about you before that. I read a couple of your blogs before a long time ago. Like every once in a while, like you'll trickle into my headphone or like you'll show up on my browser. But I never really like done
I'm
any.
stalking you, man. I'm stalking you. I'm finding ways to pervade your life.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, you contribute to it. I think the last thing that I saw by you, and this was probably a while back, maybe 6 months ago or longer. You had like the top 10 things that conference speakers shouldn't do, or was it technical bloggers shouldn't do, something like that. And I had browsed it,
Yeah.
right? But there's something I'm curious about your thoughts because I know for a fact I could learn a lot from you.
Okay.
So like this is going to be somewhat of a long story. I'm going to try to consolidate it to like 3 minutes. Okay.
Okay. All
I
right.
I was I was I had to delete a video that I posted like 3 hours ago because when I was now I just record everything live on YouTube
Right.
because I'm pretty much the only person that listens to it, even though I'm approaching like 30 subscribers on YouTube or whatever. But like,
Congratulations.
oh, thanks. I don't know. I guess you got to start somewhere, but
Exactly.
it's kind of
Exactly.
therapeutic. It's kind of therapeutic for me.
Yeah.
And you know what else is therapeutic is venting out loud, which I didn't realize I was really doing. So let me just go ahead and tell you what happened.
All right.
I was washing my bike outside in the driveway, and I always like to multitask. I like to learn about new things, etc., while I'm doing something else that doesn't really require mental thought. And so, like, I was listening to this podcast, and it was based on object oriented programming and I won't say best practices, but it's basically on like how people should leverage object oriented programming languages.
Right.
And I was listening to it, and I mean, for the past like 12 months, I've been digging into functional programming or functional first, and so I developed somewhat of a bias, somewhat dogmatic belief system. And so it was the guest was a lady, and she went on the podcast show to express her ideas and ultimately help others, right?
Right.
And but there are some things that she had said that really struck a nerve with me based on my past experiences of working with various shops. And so I was like, yo, this would be a great session for me to I didn't know I was going to vent, but I thought
Mhm.
it was going to be a great session for me to share my opinion based on this episode that I listened to, right? And so I went like I think I delivered like a half an hour dissertation on what the guest had said on the show, and how I had a quote unquote difference of opinion, translated how much I disagreed with it.
Right.
And I went in deep, right? And while I was giving it, while I was recording, like I thought I was doing
Uh-oh.
good. You know, I was getting my point across, and as far as I'm concerned, they were valid points that will invoke discussion. I actually reviewed my recording. Like I watched my YouTube video, and I came off. Man, I'm very disappointed at how I came off. Like I came off very rude. I came off as a jerk, and what made it even more bad, even though it shouldn't matter, and maybe now I know how like white folks feel when they're trying to share their opinion about somebody that might be black, but they're trying to be careful depending on what location they're in, etc. It's
Right.
like because the guest was a female, I felt like it would be interpreted that I'm attacking her because she's a female and not just a developer. And
Right.
so to make long story short, I didn't know that I was venting, and I didn't know I was coming off really disrespectful until I watched myself from the outside looking in. I feel horrible. I deleted the video.
Right.
Um, have you ever experienced that on your own, or have you ever seen other people follow the same pattern and like, oh my God, what is he doing? Career limiting move.
So it's not all that uncommon, to be
Okay.
honest with you, from the standpoint that there's a couple of stories I can share with you. One is my sister actually is a paid actress. She's not an actress like the waitress at the diner still waiting to break into acting. My sister is actually paid to act, and she was doing a movie. It was a parody of Silence of the Lambs called Silence of the Clams, and it was a complete parody of the horror flick. But she said most interesting experience she ever had was at one point she was sitting on a chair while they were doing sets and makeup and all that other stuff, and she's just waiting for for her scene to begin. And the camera happened to be focused on her, and she happened to be looking at some of the raw footage later, and she realized people would walk by and she would look up at them, and they would kind of scurry on. And it wasn't until she reviewed the footage that she realized that she was in major resting bitch face that day. I mean, just she was, and she didn't even realize it. It wasn't that anything was particularly wrong. It wasn't that she was angry. It's just that's just kind of how she looked. And it was one of those things where seeing how other people can see you, the camera is very good at that. And in many cases, this is why people really don't like to watch themselves on video, right? People really don't like to listen to themselves when you do a recording and whatnot. And it can be a most painfully elucidating experience. A number of years ago, I was, if you ever do a Toastmasters class, they will talk to you about your crutch words. The counter is an individual within a Toastmasters meeting who will count the number of times that you say during a presentation. And it's very, very awkward to actually hear your count, particularly when it gets up into the 3 digits and whatnot. And every one of us develop crutch words. If it's not it becomes something else. And for myself, I discovered in painful fashion what my crutch word was. I was doing an episode of .NET Rocks, and this was back when they were doing the full transcript that they would post on their website later. And the transcript was actually a service that did, they literally took every word that you said and transcribed it. And I discovered that my crutch word was right? Because after every sentence, right, I would use right to indicate that I'm done talking, right? And then, right, and it was just painful to read because there it is, like every sentence was at least right, appearing at least once. And this is part of the reason why when I talk to people about speaking, I do some speaking coaching as part of my day job, but then periodically I've worked with some other folks in the industry around how to give technical presentations. And one of the things I will tell them is it's very painful and very important to watch yourself, to listen to yourself, because I have a similar kind of problem that you were describing. I can very easily just go off and talk for hours. Ask any of my family. My wife calls it lecture mode. And every once in a while now, she's gotten to the point where she just kind of goes, honey, you're in lecture mode. You need to stop. I'm like, okay, dear. I'll stop. Because when you give presentations, you get used to the idea of talking at half hour, 45, 60, 75-minute chunks. And a presentation is all a one-way conversation. It's all coming from here, or it's the room is silent. Used to this idea of, in a normal conversation, I might have, one or two things that I will say in response to you. But when you become a lecturer, when you become a speaker, you don't think in one or two sentences. You start thinking in whole paragraphs. You start thinking in whole, I need to fill the next hour with all
dissertation.
Exactly. And so you start thinking about all these things that you want to say and how you want to say it and different analogies. And sometimes we lose sight of the fact that there is actually another person over there that, will tell me when there's more information that they want, or do they actually get it the first time? So yeah, this is not an uncommon phenomenon. And I forget who it was, but there's one of the ancient philosophers made some comment along this line. Oh, if only I could see myself as others could see me, it would be, it's incredibly elucidating. It's incredibly insightful to see how you're actually perceived as opposed to the way you think.
It was an eye opener, and I feel really bad. I didn't know how I was coming off into exactly what you said. I looked at myself, and the thing was, it's I wasn't attacking that person. I was just venting.
Right.
And I was usually when I say you, when I'm recording a YouTube session, I mean just mainstream developers, but they would never know because I mentioned I was listening to this lady, share her thoughts on object-oriented programming, and that's all I said. And when I started venting and ranting, all I said was "you this, you that," but So
part of the problem is fails us a little bit here from the standpoint that you is the second person singular as well as you is the second person plural. Right?
Yeah.
So in French, for example, we have tu, meaning the second person singular, meaning usually that it implies a certain amount of intimacy between you and I, versus vous, which is second person plural and usually the more formal. So in that case, had you been doing this in French, you'd have had a much easier way to differentiate, because when you're talking to your YouTube audience, you can say vous, but when you're talking to that particular person, you can say tu, as to be able to differentiate. English, we only have the one word, you. And so in that sense, it can feel like, even when you're watching it later, it can feel like you're attacking that individual. But you're in fact not. You're more trying to produce a point. You're trying to produce sort of a answer to something else that was written way over there. I mean, it's difficult sometimes because the English language, for all of its relative simplicity, loses, it lacks a certain amount of nuance that we find in some other languages.
Yeah, I think the same thing is in Spanish. I mean, I'm not an expert, but I think tu is tu and usted is you, but then you have ustedes or vosotros, right? Which is you all or whatever. So thanks for being my shrink. It's now I feel like I have to do so much more to undo what I did, because I had 20 people consumed it within the past 2 hours, and now they probably are disassociating themselves with me but I just
don't fall into
the
same trap though, right? Because the way you perceived yourself may not necessarily be the same way that they perceived you. right? You can fall into this exact same trap going, oh my gosh, I have no idea how the outside world perceived me, and therefore it must be so much worse than what I think the outside world perceived me. You can fall into that trap. If you're concerned, I would suggest that you can post another video or post the original one with an edited follow-up that says, I realized when I went back and looked at this that it may have seemed like I was being overly aggressive, and that was not my intent. I apologize to the lady in the video, if she felt like she was being attacked. And you might reach out directly to say, hey, by the way, I don't know if that's how you took it, but that's certainly not how it was intended. But in some cases, that can go great lengths to convince people or to show people that you are aware of, how that may have come across, and you certainly didn't intend it, but you also don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You said some good and useful things, I'm sure, and you don't want to lose that.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, that's what's going on with me. Like, I appreciate that feedback, like, seriously, because I've been in panic mode, like, oh my God, this is over. You're only remembered for the last thing that you've done, I think. I mean, that might be invalid, but I think your impression is usually the last thing you did. And so it's a fear of that. But like, enough about me. Like, what have you been up to? You're in Seattle, right?
That's correct. I live in Seattle. I live in Redmond, Washington, about 10 minutes from the heart of the beast. So it's been raining the last week. Shock.
No.
Yeah, I know. Who would have guessed? And currently, actually, where I'm calling you from is a company called Smartsheet, located in Bellevue, which is a sister suburb of Seattle. And this is a company where I am a director of developer relations, which means basically I'm putting together a department for how the company reaches out to developers interested in the Smartsheet platform, which is a spreadsheet on the web, in the cloud, to be more specific. This is one, they talk about in the startup scene, where startups, you grow, and then all of a sudden you hit your hockey stick. They have just started their hockey stick level of growth. They were 250 people at the start of 2016, and they are currently at 400. So the company's growing, and they need to have a developer story. They need to have basically somebody to put together the group of people that will go out and talk about the developer story. So yeah, that's basically what I'm doing for them, is putting together that department, assembling all of our conference relationships, and blah, 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 blah.
Is that the same thing as an evangelist or an advocate?
So the evangelist or the advocate would report to me.
Okay.
That's basically, developer relations is more than just dev evangelism. It's also about working, for example, with the enterprise sales team as they go in and do, talking to Fortune 500s and so forth. It's also about samples. I mean, usually developer evangelism implies I'm going to go out and I'm going to speak at conferences and I'm going to do presentations at user groups. This is that plus some additional stuff. And then that whole group is developer relations, which would include documentation and articles and some of that kinds of stuff. And then I'm in the process of building that group.
So you're done with coding?
I wouldn't say done with, but I've coded for, in case you hadn't noticed the gray in my beard here.
I don't see it at all. Really?
That's there. Trust me, it's there. My kids point it out to me on a regular basis. Coding is fun, and I still enjoy it, and I still do it. As a matter of fact, I teach mobile development as a guest lecturer over at the University of Washington. So I teach iOS development and Android development. And I still write code as a part of that, figuring out what to include as part of the lecture material and having samples and all that kinds of stuff. I still code. I still like coding. But the problem is when you've been doing it for 20 years, when you've been doing anything for 20 years, you kind of reach a point where It kind of feels like we've been around this Ferris wheel a few times. I've seen the view from the top. I've seen the view from the bottom. I've seen the view from, both sides. I mean, you go around the wheel a few times, and even though there's new technologies, they all tend to be revamped ideas that have come before. Node.js, yeah, it's actually very, very similar in a lot of ways to what the Ruby world did. And the Ruby world is actually very similar in some respects to what the Smalltalk and the Lisp world were doing. And there's a little bit that's changed each time. But in some cases, it reaches a point where it's like, yeah, okay, I've been here. I've done this. And I mean, I've been an architect for a decade and a half in many cases. And so you start looking for new challenges. And in this particular case, the new challenge is management. Specifically, how do I...
Human beings.
What's that? That's part of it. But how do you create an environment where human beings will thrive? And how do you create an environment where they will... Where's that sweet spot between too much structure and not enough? Where's that sweet spot between too much process and not enough? How do you give them free rein enough that they can get what they want done, but how do you not give them so much free rein that they aren't they aren't working on the stuff that you care about, right? There's a lot of emphasis right now on, just turning developers loose and letting them work on interesting things. That's exciting for the developer, but that often doesn't work for the business, right? At the end of the day, we're supposed to be working on stuff that will generate value for the company. So where do you find that sweet spot? How do you deal with people, and how do you create an environment where people wake up, come to work, and are excited to be there? How do you create an environment where you can take the knowledge that you've had for many, many years and scale that, right? I'm used to thinking about conferences for myself. Which conferences do I want to go speak at? I have my own little algorithm that I use. How do you scale that to an organization where, for example, one of my algorithmic questions is this a city that I would find interesting? Or is this a city that my wife has never been to before? Because I will bring her with me on some of these trips. That doesn't exactly work for the company. They don't care about interesting cities, and they don't care about whether or not my wife has been there. So what's the criteria by which the company decides to go participate in a conference event? That is an interesting heuristic to have to figure out. And how do we tune that? And can we algorithmize that? Can we turn it into an algorithm? All of these kinds of things are basically the current set of problems, right? It's a whole new set of problems. And that doesn't even get into some of the traditional stuff like, keep people motivated. How do you keep people focused? How do you give them, give them interesting things to work on and still require them to work on the stuff that they don't find interesting? I mean, all of that is traditional management. Plus, then we've got the developer relations. How do I reach out to developers? How do I get them interested in the things that we're talking about? All that kinds of stuff. So,
have you noticed? I'm not even sure how I could frame this question. One is, are there different breeds of developers? I guess that would be my first question.
Absolutely, there are very different breeds of developers. The Java developer is definitely a different. They may not be, they may not be different species. They're all, Homeo developerus. If we're going to use the biological term. They all live on, pizza and caffeine of one form or another. But the Java developer is definitely a different creature than the .NET developer is. The Ruby developer is a very, very different creature from the .NET developer. The Node.js, developer is vaguely related to the Ruby developer, but not so much that they would notice or admit it. There's some similarities between these in the same way that we can look at, cats, and we look at tigers and jaguars and panthers and lions. They're all breed of cat, but they're all different. They have different habits. They have different social structures. They have different ways of looking at the world around them. They're all just a little bit different, which is part of what makes it fun for me to be going to a bunch of these different kinds of conferences and seeing some of those things play out. I mean, I've been in the Java world and the .NET world for, oh God, half now, basically, since the .NET
I'm
world.
having a flashback. I think this was you. It may not be. You got to forgive me.
Okay.
Did you ever demo SQL Server within the Java space?
Oh, I might have. I
Okay, it
don't
sounds like
remember.
maybe not.
I might
Okay,
have.
never mind.
Yeah, I might have. I know at one point I did. I know, geez, 8 or 9 years ago, I was out at Devox Antwerp, and I was doing .NET. I was doing Microsoft / Java interoperability demos there.
Okay.
Like how to use Office as a front end for Java Web Services, and I might have done something with SQL Server. Basically, here you can do it. Here's the Microsoft JDBC Type 4 driver. Party to your heart's content. But I don't know that I've ever. I don't know that I've ever done anything specific. I did do one where I had Java and .NET running inside the same process. So we had a Java Tomcat service, Java Tomcat web page that was using .NET code to send an MSMQ message over to put a message into the queue. The little .NET app responded to that and put the message back so that Java could consume it.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't mean to derail you. I'm sorry. What you were saying was really interesting, but like, there's certain things that like I'll just have a flashback and I just have to entertain it just for like a couple of seconds to like satisfy the itch. But here's something I'm curious about, and I'll just make this statement because we're talking about like breeds of developers, which I wasn't really thinking about it in that type of way that you described. So like an illustration is this: I'm in like Miami Beach, right? For whatever reason, I'll let the whole world know that, but I'll I can see a really beautiful girl and like she is stacked, right? And like she is flawless. She is like a 11 out of 10, okay? And my first thought process, and listen, I'm going to lead up to something. I'm going to connect the dots with this, all right?
Okay.
My first thought process is like, or my first thought is, whoa. But then I was like, nah, she's too high maintenance. Like, I don't want to deal with the stress of trying to maintain that type of woman. Like, I can't handle that. I can't handle that, and I don't want to. I don't want to deal with the stress of trying to keep her happy and defending her and still trying to defend my manhood all at the same time. Nah. So I choose to not want to even entertain something at that level. Why am I saying all this, right? Is there something similar to like a developer as a prima donna where like whether it's their reality or the reality, they are a rock star and they're just so high maintenance that it's not worth trying to entertain them with your business and trying to contain them. I might suck at trying to articulate this, but do you see where I'm trying to go to?
I think what you're discovering, what you're reaching towards, is something that actually I've been talking about for a while, which is to say, I find in the developer community that we have a rampant case of hubris. Hubris. So hubris is that I'm not going to get the dictionary definition, but it's this belief of superiority. It's not necessarily arrogance, but it's this belief that you have understanding of things that you don't. So, for example,
that may be me.
Well, it's everybody, right? It's everybody in the developer industry. How many times have you been in a conversation with developers talking about patents, right? Software patents, right? This is the thing that developers love to go on about: patents and intellectual property, and it's all busted. And how many of those developers are actually experts in patent law?
None of them.
This particular sense of the notion of hubris was really brought home to me back in 2010. which, if you remember, was right after the BP oil platform explosion, spill, et cetera, through the Gulf of Mexico. Huge mess. 2010, Microsoft was holding their developer conference, TechEd, in New Orleans. So we're, of course, you have the main conference, right? 10,000 developers descend upon this, but developers and IT guys. It's not just a developer event. 10,000 people in New Orleans at the New Orleans Convention Center. Great time had by all. I mean, it's New Orleans, right? That in of itself, New Orleans is a great place to hang out. And of course, with any conference that big, there's a bunch of ancillary events that go on. So you've got people doing, we're going to have our developer party over here, and somebody else is going to have their developer party over there. In this particular case, this was a developer party that was held at the New Orleans Aquarium, right there off the coast. And a couple other folks, relatively big names in the .NET space, we're all standing there together, holding our sodas and munching on our whatever little snacks they've got. And we're wandering through the various exhibits at the New Orleans Aquarium. And we run across one where it's basically describing how a pier jutting out into the Gulf can act as a coral reef system for lots of different aquatic life. The pier actually contributes to the growth of the aquatic life there in the Gulf. And we glance up, and guess who's sponsoring this display?
The people building piers.
Yep. And so, of course, that brings up the whole Deepwater Horizon thing. And, at the time, people were still trying to figure out ways in which to, contain the oil that's gushing up from underneath the ocean floor. And 6 developers with absolutely no training in fluid dynamics, petroleum, deep water operations, any sort of expertise whatsoever, we stand around very seriously discussing all the things that these people should be trying, because we're developers. We know everything. We have expertise in everything. And we're very serious about this conversation. And at a certain point, I don't know why, but at a certain point, I kind of disengaged from the conversation a little bit, and I'm listening to this, and I'm like, we're really serious about this. We really do think we have an answer for this problem that is plaguing some of the nation's finest minds just 100 miles out. That they can't solve it, but we have the answers.
Yeah.
And I see this playing out over and over and over again amongst developers where, and it's not just developers. I mean, I see it among doctors and lawyers and some other, people who use their brain on a regular basis, genuinely believe that, well, I am smart enough to be able to do this one thing very well. Therefore, that means I'm smart enough to do anything, right? You get a software developer and he accidentally walks in on a brain surgery, he's going to start giving the surgeon directions on where exactly he should start cutting, because he's a developer and he uses his brain, so he must know about brains, therefore he can do brain surgery.
I often say, I skydived it's probably been 6 months ago, and I used to tell friends yo, even if I have a backup chute and my primary chute doesn't open, I'll probably die because I'll be trying to figure out why my primary chute never opened all the way till I impact. And so, yeah, I guess it's the engineering.
There's a great joke along those lines. So during the French Revolution, right, it was well understood that if you were scheduled for execution via guillotine, if for whatever reason the guillotine failed, you went free. So the first guy comes up and he puts his head in and he whispers a prayer to the Lord, and the guy pulls the rope, and the guillotine falls and stops halfway there. And immediately everybody says, "Oh my God, it's a miracle, a miracle." And the guy goes free. Second guy comes up and he starts whispering a prayer to the Lord, and they pull the rope and the guillotine comes down, gets stuck, and "Oh my God, it's a miracle, miracle." He goes free. Third guy comes up and he happens to be an engineer, and before he goes, I see where the problem is. Engineer. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, we have, you know, I can't tell you how many times I've gotten into conversations with developers in particular around politics, economics, around international relations. I mean, these are all subjects that I studied in college. I'm not actually a computer science major. I was an international relations major. So I studied philosophy and a little bit of psychology and anthropology and sociology and tiny bit of statistics and a bunch of this other stuff. Are standing there. No. What America should do is we should just nuke all of the Middle East or whatever particular position. They're always simple answers. Everybody has these. If only we would ... everything would be better. And the part that strikes me so much when I hear these things is it's like, okay, first of all, can you imagine that nobody in the White House has even thought of this? I mean, let's step back for a second and suggest that absolutely nobody in either the Obama or the Bush or any other administration, nobody has ever actually said, well, what would happen if we just nuked it all to a sheet of glass? No, for some reason, nobody's ever had that thought. Nobody's ever had that question. That's farcical. That's absolutely ludicrous. There are people who are paid literally to sit around all day and figure out all kinds of different solutions. And then people within the Pentagon and so forth, they will conduct war games. What would happen if we did this? What would be the response? What would be the reactions, et cetera? And the fact that we haven't done it suggests that people have found some fairly serious problems with this. But the idea that it's an idea that I came up with, and therefore it's better than everybody else's idea because I know why it would work and nobody else can see inside my head. This is hubris. This is our belief that somehow what we have, we collectively as an industry versus me individually, however you want to phrase it, this is a serious problem we've got. We, right now, I can't tell you how many software developers I talk to who are convinced that software is going to make the world a better place. And, you know, I can tell you for a fact that particularly if you go back through history, pretty much every invention that was new and took the world by storm was convinced it was going to make the world a better place. And it didn't. It didn't.
Really? All right. So here's my thoughts, right? And most people don't agree with my thoughts. But like one is, do you think developers exhibit that mentality or behavior because they look at the world as object oriented, right? Like my biggest pet peeve or something I just don't understand is and I'm going to try to maintain or stay on topic of what you're talking about is like they try to prophesy. I always say this when in conversations. They try to prophesy how a system is going to work, right? And this is when I was ranting on that video that I deleted. But they will automatically think about all the classes that are going to represent the real world objects and how they're going to collaborate together, as if the world really is fixed, or as if the business analysts or stakeholders don't make discoveries or change their mind, right? And so this is my biggest pet peeve about how object-oriented programming languages, they encourage big upfront design instead of people like focusing on business rules. But anyway, I'm saying all this because, well, do you think developers exhibit that behavior because this is what they do every day? They create models and then they breathe life into it, and that's just their thought process. That's their paradigm.
So I wouldn't limit it to object-oriented developers, right?
Okay.
I mean, functional guys can fall into the same trap because it's basically the same thing. We are accustomed to the idea of seeing the world in terms of a model, in terms of seeing the world as a set of descriptive truisms, right? And one of the things, interestingly enough, that if you study philosophy for any length of time, you begin to realize that a model is just that. A model is just a representation of the real world. It isn't the real world. But because we as programmers get so caught up in the idea of the model is the world is the model, we lose sight of that. And so we reach a situation where we start believing that the world will behave according to the model that we've set out inside of our head.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, that's not just developers that do that. It's all human beings, right? If you walk over to a light switch, right, and you see this little toggle thing, right, you already have a mental model that says it is either an on or an off switch, as opposed to when you walk up to the light switch and there is a dial there. You have a mental model as to how these things are going to behave. And if you flip the switch and realize that it's actually a slider, whereas the dial has a point at which it clicks and it goes from on to off or off back to on, your mental model is now being violated. And you find yourself having to reacquaint yourself with how the model works. There's some really interesting work here that's generally geared more towards the UI UX world. But there's a guy by the name of Donald Norman, who talks about the real world models that we deal with on a regular basis. Have you ever walked up to a door, Scott, and gotten it wrong? You see one of those doors.
Walked into a window or something?
No. I mean, you walk up to the door and you hit it on.
Oh, yeah.
I think it opens and it doesn't. It opens on the other side. Why did you do that? It's a really fascinating thing. You look at the door and you realize, okay, I assumed based on, because when you're on the inside, you can't see where the hinges are, so you don't know which way it swings. So I assume that that side is where I'm going to have to hit it in order to be on the non-swinging side, right? So that it's easiest to open the door. But the fact that the door has a bar that stretches all the way across the length of the door, it's effectively a user interface fail because it violates your mental model.
Yeah.
If you've ever gotten into a car with somebody and watched them crank the heater, you know, it's cold, so you're in Miami Beach. You would never feel this, of course. But if you're in Minnesota, you get into a car and it's cold, right? And it's like, oh man, it's freezing, and I want to warm up really, really quickly. People will crank it all the way up to like max. Well, if it's just a slider, that's one thing. But when they put it up to like 85 degrees on the little built-in internal thermostat, there's this belief that somehow the car will get warmer by going to 85 as opposed to just leaving it at 78.
Yep.
The internal thermostat is going to try to...
I do it.
Yeah. Because your mental model is still thinking back to those old slider-based interfaces where you had to max it out first, and then once it got a little too warm, you'd start edging it back. You can do the experiment, right?
My dog does the same thing. I study my dog, and my dog, I mean, I think most mammals they're intelligent enough to understand patterns.
Yeah.
And my dog will walk up to a faucet and just wait, because as far as it's concerned, this water comes out of it, right? And I observe things like that, right, where they just have certain expectations. It's just not just human beings, right?
Yeah, right. These are the experiments Pavlov did way back when, that you could actually get them to understand those things. You have, in essence, trained your dog to know that water comes out of the faucet because when he walks over, you walked over with a bowl and put water in it. So the dog very quickly built a mental model that says, if I stand here, what I want comes to me, right? Yep. Your dog does the same thing when it goes to the door and looks outside. You're like, uh-oh, puppy's got to go outside because you don't want to mess on your carpet or your hardwood floor. So you walk over and you open the door. And the interesting thing about Pavlov here is to ask, did you train the dog or did the dog train you?
The dog trained me, and it took me a while to realize that.
Yeah.
That dog, I would have company over, and and that dog would like get jealous, and she would start barking, and I'm like, oh, let me figure out what's wrong, Cookie, and I would tend to that dog's need every single time she would bark.
Yeah.
And it took me a while to realize that dog knew every time she barked, she would have my attention. And it didn't dawn on me until like later that's what she was doing. Yeah, she had me trained. When she barked, which is analogous to snapping fingers, I stopped everything I was doing to see what she needed and how I could silence her. And that's how she got food. That's how she got pampered, etc.
Yeah, treats. Yeah. And the interesting thing is we don't want to anthropomorphize the dog to say that the dog was jealous per se, as much as it was the dog learned barking gets me X. So if the dog wanted X, it barked and it got it. It's a very clear cause and effect. This is what I mean by we all build mental models of the world around us, how it behaves, how it works. And when something comes along that challenges those mental models, right? And I'm going to go back to what you opened up with, when you see that really, really hot girl walking down the street.
I'm already making the connection. I'm listening.
Your mental model says, oh, wow, that's a really beautiful woman. And you start building out based on your past experience or based on what your friends have done or based on what you've seen in movies.
Belief system.
Mental model as to how it's going to work. And in some cases, this is the problem that we have with stereotypes in general, is our mental model of how a particular group behaves doesn't always fit the reality of the situation, right? Our mental model, for example, 150 years ago, our mental model of what white people and black people were like was horribly broken, nowhere close to reality. But it's taken this long for us to be able to come back around and realize that, yeah, no, Scott has certain characteristics, certain properties about him in terms of the melatonin in his skin, but that doesn't necessarily imply anything about him. We have to reset some of those mental models, and that's the problem that we run into. That's the problem that a lot of male developers have with female developers. That's the problem that a lot of people have with people of other colors, right? This is a general issue. It's a problem that people in Seattle have with people in New Orleans. We're all building this mental model of, the hick redneck down here in the South versus the presumptuous, pretentious liberal up here along the West Coast, versus the farmer up there in the New England Northeast. We all have these mental models of how we believe people will behave, because that's a lot quicker and easier than trying to dig into each individual person and figure out about them. We have to build these models. So now it becomes a question of, how do I keep the model but remain open to new ideas, new experiences, new concepts, right? How do I remain open to the idea that, hey, that hot chick, maybe she's one of those that actually isn't high maintenance because she's actually never been out on a date because everybody else is too intimidated to ask her out on a date. Yeah. I had that exact experience in high school, not being the hot chick, but it was a girl, cheerleader I had a crush on. And at our 10-year reunion, I asked her to dance and we were dancing. And I said, I just have to admit it. I had a huge crush on you in high school. And she looked at me like, why didn't you ever ask me out? And I said, oh, because, you were a cheerleader and I was just one of the geeks in the honors program. She's like, I never went on a date in high school. She actually got mad at me because I never actually asked her out. She wanted to go out with people, but no guy would ever ask her because she was a cheerleader and therefore, unapproachable. So it's okay. We have to build those mental models, but then the question becomes, how do we challenge them in such a way that we remain open to whatever the reality of the situation is? Any model is not the same as reality. And we have to keep that very firmly fixed, because whether we're programming or whether we're just living, the reality is not the model.
Well, I'm not challenging what you're saying.
Philosophers love challenge, and I'm a philosopher, so bring it.
I'm tossing in a question.
Okay.
Again, you're well versed. You know way more about this than I do. But I think I do understand the purpose of developing or building a model to understand things better. That model doesn't necessarily have to be perfect or reflect the true reality, but it provides perhaps some level of abstraction that we can comprehend and move forward with. Now, what you provided an example of, or that illustration, example of, approaching someone that doesn't fit the model, or let me say this again. That girl that's a 10 or 11 out of 10, right? Just beautiful, and based on my past experiences, I develop a model of no, Scott, she's way too hot. She's out of your league. Scott, she's going to be really expensive. Do you really want to spend your money maintaining her or whatever? Do you really want to go to the bar and always have to like be aggressive to be alpha and all that other stuff? Like, is it really worth it? Now, why am I saying all this? I agree with you when it comes to developing a model, but that really beautiful woman that goes against my belief system of how she's going to respond when I address her, that is really an exception, or is it not? Like, what's the definition of an exception when it comes to a model?
So here's where we start getting, again, we're channeling a little philosophy here, which is to say, if you have a vision of how the world works, right, there's two ways really to go about verifying this. Both of them have to do with evidence. You either look for evidence that supports the case, or you look for evidence that contradicts the case. And the problem with looking for evidence that supports your theory is that confirmation bias, which is a psychological principle, right? If you believe, your best friend gets a Mini, right? He goes off and buys one of those little Mini, the British cars, right? And suddenly you start looking around and you start seeing the Mini everywhere. You're like, oh my gosh, it must be a really popular car. What's happening is confirmation bias. Your brain, now having picked up on the fact that the Mini is a thing, you start seeing all the Minis that had always been there, but you were filtering that information out because it wasn't relevant at the time. So the problem with looking for evidence that supports your theory is you fall victim to confirmation bias. So this is where Karl Popper was one of the philosophers who believes in what he calls a falsification methodology. You start looking for the evidence to deliberately disprove your theory, which in this case suggests, okay, if you really want to verify whether or not this model is correct or incorrect, you need to start looking for the 11s and looking to discover who they are as a way of disproving your theory. You walk up to them and you assume that they're really nice people. You assume that they don't need you to be the alpha. They're perfectly capable of defending themselves. They don't need you to rescue them. They just want, they're actually looking for a guy who isn't the alpha, because everybody knows, Scott, alpha males are just really hard to put up with. They always got to be right. They always got to be spending money. They always got to be doing. And you start putting yourself in the other position, and you start realizing, yeah, being the alpha isn't always that great. Sometimes it's actually nice to be the beta male and let some other guy be, here, hold my beer and jump off the roof, because that's what the alpha will do. Everybody tell him no, right? For the evidence to deliberately falsify your model, to find where it breaks down. And bear in mind, right, you may actually find the model to say, okay, you know what, you're right. These 11s, they're actually really nice people. And I don't need to be the alpha with them. And I found this really wonderful woman. And at that point, remember, put it all into context. At that point, you found this really, really wonderful woman that you're desperately in love with. You can stop trying to falsify your model because you found what you were really looking for, right? The point simply is the falsification methodology actually works in many cases better. Anytime in today's political climate, anytime somebody says, well, all illegal immigrants, ... or all Muslims, ... or all black people, or all white people, my first thought, if I could actually find the individual saying that statement, my first thought is, well, what evidence do you have not to support it, but what evidence have you run across that disproves it? Because usually what we will do is we will deliberately cherry pick the evidence that supports our intrinsic theory, open to the evidence that contradicts it. And this is where Facebook, for example.
I'm guilty of that.
Yeah, we all are, Scott. We all are. Even aware of it as I am. I still find myself going through Facebook and I see one of those anti-Trump memes and I'm like, yeah, you go. I should probably verify that before I share it. It's just easier to share it. Let's just go on. right? We're all guilty of it because life is a lot easier living in that ivory tower, living with that confirmation bias. Those things which are right are not always easy. And so in some cases, particularly if you're going to get into a conversation with somebody whose opinion you care about, whose viewpoint you care about, if you care about the way in which you are viewed to the rest of the world, then you really need to do your homework. You really need to do the not easy thing. And you start looking for the information that disproves. And as a case in point, I will flip it around on you, right? You were venting and ranting about object-oriented and everything that was wrong with it.
I was unloading. Yeah.
Flip it around, my friend. Flip it around. And now falsification. Start looking for the evidence that suggests that object orientation is, in fact, a good way of looking at the world. What about your understanding of functional programming is wrong, and what about your understanding of object-oriented programming is wrong? Because personally, I will stand here, and we can do this on a separate occasion, but I believe, quite frankly, that the best results occur from a union of those two approaches, not one or the other, right? I believe very strongly in the F-sharp and the Scala hypothesis, which is to say a functional object hybrid language is much better than a pure functional or a pure OO language.
Can you repeat the last 5 seconds? It went out.
Yeah. So I believe very strongly in the F-sharp Scala approach, which says that a functional object hybrid language is much better than a pure functional or a pure object language. Because I've programmed in both pure functional and pure object. And F-sharp and Scala as the mix of both, far, far easier, far better, because now I have just that much more in the way of tools in my tool chest that I can use.
I was on .NET Rocks last Wednesday, I think, and yeah, that's essentially what I said. You know, they had Richard had asked me a question about did I know what a monad was? I'm like, no, not really. My understanding is it's meant to it's a functional approach to interacting with the outside world. That's my limited understanding, if that's even accurate. And then he said, well, how do you do I/O? And I was like, well, who says it has to be functional? F-sharp is functional first, so it's fully object oriented. So yeah, to your point, I kind of discovered, and again, I'm not the technical authority, but I have a better understanding in my early adoption of this new technique / paradigm, what is helpful for me so far in my limited experience to go functional versus to go object oriented. So yeah. I am dogmatic, like I am, but it's a struggle, right? To take a step back and really try to figure out, like, what am I really fighting for? And is it, as you said, like the absolute truth? It's hard, man. We have to have our own little advisors, just like the president, so that we're not full of ourselves. I'm dead serious.
Well, part of it is a mental, it's a mental state of acceptance, right? This is where some of the mindfulness stuff that's becoming more popular these days can be very helpful, to simply accept that, the way things are the way things are, right? That this is the moment, and that the moment will pass. And interestingly enough, a lot of the mindfulness movement echoes another ancient philosophical tradition called Stoicism, the Stoics. Stoics are always portrayed as... I
think I'm familiar with that.
Well, the Stoics were always portrayed as these people with no emotions whatsoever, Vulcans, if you will, from Star Trek. But
not Klingons? Okay.
Yeah. No, the Klingons subscribe to a different philosophy. The Stoics actually were not anti-emotion. They were actually very emotional. They basically said, though, that, look, all good things in time must come to an end, right? And it you will die, I will die, my wife will die, my kids will die. Come to grips with that now. And what that means is celebrate the things that you can while you can, right? I will, if I have a choice between watching TV versus playing a video game with one of my, adult sons, I'll choose the latter,
because there will come a time when I won't be able to do that anymore for whatever reason. They won't be living at home. Something could happen to one of them. Something could happen to me. To try to enjoy that which you can. Understanding that all of us have responsibilities. All of us have things that we have to do. I mean, I have to work. I have to make money. I have to pay for the house, etc. But the house is a place where my family gathers to rest, relax, be with one another, to recharge, to go face the rest of the day. I don't need a $5 million mansion. The home that I've got is perfectly acceptable for what I want to do, and so on and so on. The Stoics were very big on accepting the things that you can change, but accepting the things that you can't either. There are things in my life that I can change, and there are things in my life that I cannot. I cannot change the course of a presidential election. I'll be the first to admit I did not want Mr. Trump to take the White House, but he's there. And, it's all completely outside of my control. I can either get really, really angry about it and vent and rant and scream on Facebook, but most of that is basically just going to have more of a negative impact on me than I will a positive impact on anybody else around me. So, okay, what can I do? Well, if I really don't like the man, I suppose I could join a protest movement, or I could work to see that Democrats get elected in the midterm elections, or I could, do some sort of analysis to try to figure out how, there's lots of different things I can do to try to change something. But all of those things versus all of the other things that I could do. I could write another technical book. I could write a book on philosophy. I could study political philosophy. Tons of things that I could be doing right now. Now it's a question of, what do I choose to be doing? What do I choose to be engaging, spending my time in? Because that's the other thing. All of us have 89,000 seconds per day. What do we choose to do with those 89,000 seconds? Well, I'll be honest with you. One of the things I will do with some percentage of them is sleep. I like to sleep. I like to sleep in. I like, like being in under the covers, under the comforter, and 7, 8 o'clock in the morning when it's all gray and misty and raining outside, etc. That's how I choose to spend my time, and I'm comfortable with that decision. Part of this is we talk about models. We talk about building what the ancient philosophers called eudaimonia, the good life. What defines the good life for you? What defines the good life for me? And being aware of the fact that the good life is different for different people and all of those kinds of stuff. I mean, this is part of the reason why I think developers, this is kind of my last rant for the time. I believe that developers should stop studying algorithms and technology and should study philosophy, psychology, history, sociology, anthropology. Because I think they would find that a lot of the questions that we believe we are wrestling with for the first time, that mankind has wrestled with for the past 3,000 years. And there are a lot of interesting answers to be found out there amongst the dead Greeks and the things that they wrote, if we're open to the idea of, maybe I'm not the smartest person in the room, and maybe I'm not the smartest person to have ever thought this question. And yeah, I'm open to learning something new about life that doesn't have anything to do with technology.
When you were talking about, am I saying this right? Stoicism?
Stoicism, yep, the Stoics. Stoicism.
I keep having to listen to this book over and over and over again called "The Obstacle Is the Way." I'm not sure who the author is, but essentially, the book, or this book, "The Obstacle Is the Way," advocates, hey, instead of complaining and screaming, woe is me, why did this have to happen? Why are things so hard? How come they don't understand, what I'm talking about? Like, instead of just, I'm really good at venting. I'm really good at complaining. I should get paid for this. But instead of doing all this, they said, embrace it. like leverage it and use it as a defining reason, or essentially a defining reason of why you are the chosen person to do whatever you're chasing after. And so they give illustrations of, or examples of, Abraham Lincoln, Obama, and Reverend Wright, whatever his name is, where specifically with the Reverend, which I guess he was like, I don't know what you call him, a black supremacist, whatever he is. Instead of Obama completely disassociating himself with the entire dinner room or dinner table conversation about racism in America, both sides, Obama, this book, the way I interpreted this book, basically talked about how Obama, instead of him running away from it, he used it as a platform to draw white and black and any other colors together, and how this is important to talk about. And he actually united people instead of entertaining what the media probably wanted to push people further away. And so, to make a long story short, when you discuss Stoicism, I think about that book and how I have to repeatedly consume this book over and over again so I could slowly but hopefully surely reprogram myself.
Right.
I have some bad programming from public education.
We all do. We all do. And quite honestly, even if it's, I mean, whether it's from public education, whether it's from your upbringing, whether it's from, I mean, we all of us got messages. We all of us internalized issues, problems, whatever, over the years. Part of this is where you start channeling some of the Japanese, right? And you start channeling their notion of continuous improvement, right? You can only, Kaizen, which the softer craftsmanship movement loves to toss around. But continuous improvement doesn't always mean you're continuously looking to improve your development processes. Part of it is continuously improving this as well, right? And part of that means, okay, how do I know? How do I measure? What do I measure myself against in terms of to determine where I need to improve? Not for the sake of competitiveness. I need to be better than you, damn it. But from the standpoint of, yeah, that guy over there, he's living his life in a way that I would like to. I would like to live my life that way. The first step is opening your mind up to the idea that there are other people doing things that you might like to be doing for yourself. There's a friend of mine, David Giard, who's a developer evangelist for Microsoft. And David, he does a daily affirmation every day on Facebook. He says one thing as to why his life is a good life. And that's really affirming, just to read them. It's like, wow, that's really cool. I don't do the affirmation online, but every day, I try every day, stop, take a step back, look around and say, you know what, I really have a good life. I work for a good company. They're willing to put up with my quirks. Or I'm married to a wonderful woman, right? We've been married for 24 years now. And, I don't know how she puts up with me and some of the crap that I put her through. But, at the same time, she says the same thing about me. How do you put up with the crap I put you through? I have two wonderful kids. They're 23 and 17, so they're not really kids anymore. I have two wonderful men that I sired a long time ago, a quarter of a century ago. I have wonderful parents. I mean, when you start looking at the good things in your life, right? This daily affirmation, it's like, wow, yeah, no, I've got a lot of really good things. And it's hard to be angry when you see all of those really good things laying out in your life. This was part of what the Stoics taught. This is part of the mindfulness, to be aware of where you are, be aware of the moment, what's happening right now. And part of this is, being open to the idea of what else is out there around you. There are people who live in a much nicer house than I do. Bigger, they've got a better lawn, they've got a better yard. It would be nice to live in a house like that, but at the same time, that would require putting in a lot of work and, working 80 hours a week and busting my butt to create maybe a startup that will eventually go public. And there's no guarantee of that success. And you can start doing these calculations, this heuristic in your head that says, yeah, I like my house, and that house over there is really nice, but not so much do all of those things necessary to get there. So I'm comfortable with this. I'm okay with that. You know, I drive a 1997 Saturn. Things on its last legs, right?
You?
Yeah, I drive a 97 Saturn. 20-year-old.
Ted Neward. You should be pushing like at least like I see these new BMWs. They look really cool. They're called an I something. I think they're like $120,000. Like, yo, your celebrity status. Like, oh, what's going on? You need to move down here to South Beach.
No, see, and that's the thing is I don't need a BMW. I don't want a BMW. Mostly because then something about driving a BMW, you forget how to use your turn signals. It's really weird.
In Miami, you don't need it because most people here are immigrants and it's not enforced the traffic laws. So I called an Uber. He didn't use one turn signal at all, and it's a pet peeve. I have like OCD, but yeah.
At the end of the day, you know, I would much rather take the money that I might spend on a BMW and take me, my wife, my kid over to Europe for something, or go to South America, or, you know, I would much rather spend the money on experiences rather than stuff. So that's just me, though. Yeah. Other people will make different decisions, and that's their choice. I'm not going to get
just one little thing, and I'm sure your time is precious. I really appreciate this. Yo, you buy a fast car or a fast bike, you create experiences with that. But I'm dead serious. But
I know. One of my good friends is Miguel Castro, and he's got a Cobra GT or something that's convertible, tricked out. I think that thing has. Last time I talked to him, I think he said he was going to put in a supercharger, was going to take it to like 650 horsepower. I'm like, dude, you live in New Jersey. Where do you even drive that thing? It's like, oh, I go on road trips and get outside the city and open that thing up. And, oh, geez, you know, I'm like, all right, one of these days, Miguel, I'm going to hop in a car with you, and we're going to take that thing up to 120 and hopefully not kill ourselves. But, yeah, I mean, you know, don't get me wrong. I'm a big fan of the adrenaline experience, you know, let's get it. I mean, I would love to car that goes 100 something miles an hour, but I don't need to own it. I just want to rent it for one day.
Okay. Yeah. I never really considered that part.
Yeah.
Ted, I really appreciate it. Yo, thanks. I mean, I just reached out to you like, yo, record a conversation with me. And that's all I really said. And you're like, yeah, that's what's up. You've contributed to, well, I mean, you got me hip to a couple of things, right? I'm going to try to focus more on not just studying software all the time. And I don't know where to start, but that's my own problem. So I'll figure that out on my own.
I'll tell you a quick story real quick. The whole, I have no idea where to start. That is, to me, a beautiful state of affairs, because if you don't know where to start, you can go in any direction and you're not wrong. And this became really clear to me once I was doing a video interview like this, but in person, you know, with multiple cameras and so forth. I was doing an interview of Bjarne Stroustrup, the guy who invented the C++ language. Yeah. So he was one of my heroes. It would be like interviewing Anders Hallsberg today, or
Don Syme,
or Mats right over in the Ruby world, or what have you. And was sitting down, was talking with Bjarne, and I forget what we were talking about, but he said, you know, one of the things you realize as you get older in this industry is the more you know you don't know. And I mean, here's a guy who's, you know, his contributions to computer science, I mean, he contributes more each day than I will possibly do in my entire career. And here's a guy basically admitting that he doesn't know. You start running through the list of all these technologies and what, Bjarne doesn't know any of that stuff. He knows what he knows. He knows C++, and he knows how to build languages really, really well. And once you sort of realize that there's no possible way that any of these experts, any of these people, these thought leaders, etc. I mean, again, we all have 89,000 seconds in a day. What do you choose to spend your time with, right? The more you know, the more you see, the more you go out and experience things in the industry, the more you realize how much there is to know. And so it's like, all right, I'm going to deliberately choose to know this. I don't know how to change the oil in my car. I honestly don't. One of those things.
Not alone.
That's what Jiffy Lube is for, right? I take it over there and I say, here's like a couple $100. Do what you got to do, man. Call me when it's done. I'm going to spend the time reading a book on philosophy, or I'm going to spend the time looking at something online, you know, how to build a Chrome extension or something like that. I'm going to go choose to spend my time here. And then periodically I will go choose and do something completely different. So a couple of years ago, I took up glass blowing just because it was so far off my radar. I was like, okay, why not? I'm going to try it. Whatever you do, realize that you are more than just your title. There are a lot of people who really seem to be living the idea that I am this title. I am a programmer, and therefore my entire life is defined as programming. No, you're a brother, you're a son, you're a neighbor, you're a casual passerby to somebody who needs help. You are so many different things, so many different facets. And when you want to start thinking about work-life balance, you start saying, okay, well, you know, I spend a lot of time in my chosen industry, sure, but are there other things that I can do? And when you start exploring some of those other things, you start realizing that they can all feed back. There is no such thing as useless knowledge. So, yeah, go study that programming shit, but go study a few other things too, because that's whatever it is, music, software, go study whatever you want.
And so, like, man, I would love to like archive my next question for like another time. Is based on what you just said, like there's times where like I'm fairly new to Twitter. I didn't like it. I didn't understand it when it first came out, but now based on how I leverage it as a tool, I'm into it, right? But based on what you just said, and again, we won't go into it, but if it's not you, I'm going to pull someone out that I respect, and I'm going to get them to talk about it. Is I feel like there's a reason why I mentioned Twitter is I feel like I can only tweet about software, even though I'm really into motorcycles now. Like this is something new to me, and I am into issues that my country still struggles with, you know, since the Civil War times, right? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of things that I care about, but and I'm going to archive this for a discussion with someone, is I feel that does not help, quote unquote, my business brand. I'm more than a developer, right? I'm not a father or a husband yet. I mean, those are things that I'm going to aspire to be. But there's other things that I'm really into that I have an opinion about and that I'm a professional student in that I feel like is a conflict of interest based on what the world sees me as. Because this world, including myself, we put everybody in buckets. This is what you are, right?
So I'm going to give you the really short answer, and then we'll wrap up because I do have some other stuff to do today. When you decide... the key word that you mentioned was branding, professional branding, right? Decide for yourself what each of the social media channels is going to be. So for example, Twitter is, because I don't control who follows me, Twitter is my pseudo professional channel where I will say stuff about software, but I will occasionally say things that I think are important to people in my industry as well. And yes, I will let some politics in through my Twitter as well, because I think that's important. My blog, 100% pure professional branding, right? Because that stuff's what Google's going to find, and that stuff's going to live forever, and that's where I do essays that are specifically professional in nature. Facebook is, first of all, I've closed Facebook off to the public, right? You cannot read anything I write on Facebook unless you're a friend, because that's where I'm going to talk about family, friends, my vacation, the whole nine yards. That's my living room, so to speak, where people that I've invited in can be a part of that. Whatever decisions you make about social channels, make them deliberately and then follow your own rules. And if that works for you, great. And if those rules don't work for you, well, then feel free to change them. They're your rules. But make your rules. Build your model as to how you want to leverage these things for yourself. Pursue it. Go do that. That's the short version of that.
Okay. Thank you. Yo, I'm going to marinate on all this. Ted, I really appreciate it. How do people find you? Like, what platforms are you on? What's your blog called?
The blog is just blogs.tedneward.com. So it's just self-hosted. And I'm on Twitter. Like I said, Facebook is closed. So, if you're not a friend, if you and I have not sat in a room together, figuratively or literally speaking, generally I don't accept random solicitations there. But I do a lot of conferences. In February, I will be down in Atlanta for DevNexus, which is a great show, particularly if you're of the Java-esque persuasion. Doing VS Live Orlando, your neck of the woods, more or less, a little bit north of you. I'll be there next week, as a matter of fact.
Jeremy Bites is supposed to be there, too. I don't know if you know who Jeremy Bites is. Jeremy Clark? I don't know what his full name is. He's a .NET contributor.
I think I know who that is. Sometimes you have faces and then you have names, and sometimes they don't exactly line up inside my head. But
yeah, I did a session with him like 3 weeks ago. I'm gonna go up to Orlando, say what's up to y'all. I don't know what this conference is about. It'll be a nice little road trip.
I'll introduce you to some of the other speakers, and maybe give you an opportunity to do a few more of these. Jason Bach is a fascinating guy. Talk to him about languages. Rocky Lotka, he's a fascinating guy. He's one of those guys who's been around in the Microsoft universe since the days of old VB, right? Not VB.net, but VB.
VB6 or before that.
Yeah, Rachel Apple, that's another one. She's a fun one. And she actually works for Microsoft, and she's a very outspoken speaker, and she's got obviously some very interesting stories with respect to the whole women in tech thing, but at the same time, she's just fun to hang out with and have a beer with. I mean, all kinds of really, really cool people. So, we'll drag you along. And
look for me at the after party. I'll be there somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Come on by.
Next week. I'm serious. All right, Ted. I really appreciate it. Thank you for accepting my invitation, and this means a lot to me. You don't realize how much this means to me. So thank you. I'm gonna hit the stop broadcast button in 3, 2, 1.